So, a reading from Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 55. Now, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue. And, falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. As Jesus went, the people pressed around him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. And immediately her discharge of blood ceased. And Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and are pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him, and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." While he was still speaking, someone from the ruler's house came and said, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher any more." But Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be well." And when he came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter and John and James and the father and mother of the child. And all were weeping and mourning for her. But he said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up at once, and he directed that something should be given her to eat. Where do you go when you are desperate? Now, at this point, I'm speaking to a room of adults, but if my son, who's 8, were here, he'd be saying, "Daddy, you go to the toilet, silly." And it sounds also like at the beginning of a church service, I'd be leading into a time of notices saying, "If you so need the toilet, it's to your right at the back of church." What I'm getting at with the desperate is much deeper than that. We're not talking about needing to go to the toilet. We're talking about being desperate in life. When time seems to be running out, and you're scampering around this way and that looking for some sort of solution. Or when you've reached your very limits and you desperately just want help. And you want intervention. Or when a horrible decision looms over you like the sword of Damocles, and you know that whatever path you take is going to involve pain and confusion. Where do you go when you're desperate? In our passage this evening, we see desperation, and it's hugely emotive. Sadly, I know in a room like this, and for any listeners online, there will be some who have had the heartbreak of losing children. And it's especially heartbreaking because it's just not the natural order, is it? And I've wept with many, and I've prayed with many that have suffered in that way. And passages like this immediately bring back that very, very present pain. And to some degree, all of our hearts break. Even if we haven't experienced that specific pain, our hearts break with Jairus here, this synagogue ruler who falls at Jesus' feet in public because his only daughter is dying. She's just 12, and all of the emotional stress goes on that word only. His only daughter. I remember travelling to Sierra Leone last year it was, and I missed all of my family, don't get me wrong, but my youngest, Jessie, who's just 1 year old, and maybe I was feeling homesick, wanted to get home, but I remember praying to the Lord, please God, just let me get home. I just want to hold Jesse one last time. Just want to feel his weight. I just want to smell him. One last time, Lord. That's all I'm asking for. I was desperate. Jairus, he's a respectable man. He's well dressed, thought highly of in the community. Not used to making a scene in public, definitely not. But in desperation he does, because when you're desperate, you do anything. Don't mean to embarrass my mum, but I remember one time I was travelling with her in Canada. We were in Banff, kind of on the Canadian Rockies. And she got out the car as I was driving, and I accidentally just went over her foot. And as I stopped, the car actually stopped on her foot. And she's a wonderful Christian lady, but she let out the loudest expletive I think the whole of the Canadian Rockies heard. Elk were turning their heads. And she basically wanted me to move. Social etiquette, it goes out the window, doesn't it, when you're desperate? Now, that's a funny kind of desperate, and altogether very different kind of desperate, but we do things we wouldn't normally do when we're desperate. Back to our passage, we have Jairus, but then we also see another person, shunned by community, venture into the crowds just to get near Jesus, just to touch something he was wearing. We maybe say, oh, how superstitious. But again, you see her desperation. Desperation confronts us in this passage. So tonight I want to share 4 reasons with you why Jesus, this travelling rabbi, why Jesus is the best place to turn if you're feeling desperate. Or even if you're not feeling desperate and simply you want to know life in all of its fullness, or you want to be a part of a loving community. 4 reasons. First reason, because Jesus doesn't have a type. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. But first I want to start with an apology. And it's an apology from a pastor. I'm sorry if you've ever built up the confidence to actually go to a church service and you felt unwelcome. I've spoken with people who in moments of desperation have reached out for some kind of help, and they've found their way to a local church somewhere only to be made to feel like they don't belong, they don't fit in, or even worse, feel unwanted. Now, I say, trying to justify the feebleness of that we're all human, and the church is made up of fickle human beings who've just been singing well, our feeble frame, he knows. We get it wrong sometimes. But I am sorry if that's you. I'm sorry if you've gone to church, you felt overdressed or underdressed, or been given the impression that you've sat in somebody's pew, their favourite pew, God forbid. Sometimes the church can feel more like a members' club than what Jesus models here. And even the disciples, bless them, they fell into that trap too. At one point, they were barring little children from approaching him because in their culture, children were nobodies. Like other generations, children should be seen but not heard. What did Jesus do? Well, he welcomed the little children. He welcomed the nobodies. And he told the ego-tripping adult disciples that they were to learn from the young children. He shows us another way. And we're not to forget that he is actually the head of the church. Friends, I want to say, all are welcome. All are welcome. In our passage we find 2 very, very different individuals, both given Jesus' full attention, his welcome. Firstly, there's Jairus. And we're told in verse 41 that he's, quote, a synagogue leader, which is surprising because most of the religious leaders gave Jesus a wide berth. And yet here he is, a man of prestige and wealth, welcomed by Jesus. Secondly, we find a woman who becomes central to the narrative in this passage, who, verse 43, has been, quote, bleeding for 12 years. And as we know, that's probably reference to some sort of hemorrhage, which is not only incredibly distressing, as any of you will have known if you've had long undiagnosed conditions, but in this woman's Jewish context, with her Jewish laws, the continual bleeding also makes her ceremonially unclean. And that made the condition even worse. It felt like a tombstone tied round her neck. For that meant that she couldn't live a normal life. Even if she wanted to be a part of the community, she couldn't be a part of the community. She couldn't get near others for 12 years. What would you do? If you're in that situation, what would you do? If that was you. Mark's Gospel adds that she had spent all she had on looking for remedies. I guess we'd do the same, right? I would. She was desperate. And by the time she gets to Jesus, not only is she broke, she's doing something she shouldn't. She's ventured into a crowd, perhaps covering her head and face. Maybe today she'd be wearing a hoodie, a cap, to disguise herself so that no one recognizes her as the unclean woman. Such is her desperation. These are the people we find Jesus welcomes. Both ends of the spectrum. He has no type. And I come back to why I'm using that phrase, no type. And I use it with a pinch of salt because I've had friends that have gone speed dating and they're often asked, what's your type? My type? Well, she's about 5'9", brown hair, killer smile. Her name is Ellie. I'm talking about my wife. Now, I don't say that Jesus has no type to make him seem uninterested, only to show you that he welcomes all, from one extreme to the other, with all that comes in between. Perhaps a better way of putting it would be to say that all of you here, all of you listening, you're Jesus' type. He longs to welcome you, to get close to you, to embrace you, to help you in your desperation. First reason why you should turn to Jesus is because he doesn't have a type. Second reason is because if you come to him in desperation, he won't turn you away. We pick up this story just as Jesus sails back over to the western shores of the Sea of Galilee. And Luke, the writer of this gospel, he's a historian, and he meticulously tells us Jesus' whereabouts. It's important to him. He had just been on an incredibly charged mission over on the eastern shores. And there we're told that he had healed a well-known demon-possessed man causing havoc there. Just before that, he had miraculously healed a raging storm. And just before that, he had been conked out fast asleep on a boat. He was shattered before that mission. He must have been twice as shattered after all that I've just told you he's done. And he literally touches down after all of that, this mission, touches down, he gets off the boat and immediately, no time for rest, Jairus is in his face. He's there. He's on his knees before him, begging for his help to save his only daughter, who, as we know, is 12. What a leader. I love Jesus. Such a great leader. I mean, if that were me, and I was feeling as shattered as he must have been, I would be making excuses. Or I'd be trying to justify why actually now might not be the best time, Jairus, to give you my time, because I tend to make bad decisions when I'm tired and hungry, and maybe we should take this up tomorrow after I've had a rest. How unloving that would have been to have been saying that to a man who's at his lowest. But Jesus didn't do that. I said, what a leader. This is why I found Jesus so compelling. As a 17-year-old inquiring into the Christian faith, here was a leader who served truly. He always put others' needs ahead of his own. And so, yes, of course, it's no surprise. Off he goes with Jairus. If we've been reading Luke's Gospel, we just know that he's going to do that because that's the kind of man he is. Today, I guess, blue lights would arrive and he'd be whisked off. Such was the urgency of the situation. But then comes the drama. If we think that was the drama, then comes the real drama, because this bleeding woman shows up. Jairus, as I've mentioned already, is well known, and yet people have seen him lose all of his social decorum in public, literally begging Jesus through uncontrollable sobs. And so as a result, the crowds are drawn in. They're like, oh, what's Jairus doing? Jairus doesn't usually behave like that. What's going on? Crowds have gathered. They want to see what happens next. And they're pushing and shoving as Jairus tries to lead Jesus through the crowds back to his house to heal his daughter. You think London Underground at rush hour, packed in in like sardines. It's that kind of jostle and bustle. And all of a sudden, verse 45, in that environment, Jesus calls out, verse 45, "Who touched me?" And Peter, he thinks Jesus is having a moment. He says, "What are you talking about, Lord? There's a zillion people pushing and shoving right now. Are you okay?" That's the kind of response we get from Peter. Classic Peter, we might say. But Jesus knew. And in fact, the bleeding woman knew that one particular touch in that crowd had been life-changing. Verse 44, she came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. I love this. Even in a desperate rush, I mentioned the blue lights flashing, a desperate rush, Jesus has time for this woman. You know, sometimes we think that we need to get our lives right before we think we can show up in church. Or we think we've got to have cleaned ourselves up a bit before Jesus will take us. Or even, dare I say it, for any of us Christians in here who at times, I preach to myself, might be a bit overzealous, a bit self-righteous over our good doctrine. We might think that we've got to understand the gospel in depth before Jesus will take us. Or we take a look at this woman, and she seems incredibly superstitious. And she says, if I could just grab his clothes, his holy clothes. Her belief sounds a little bit hocus pocus. The edge of his cloak there may well be referring to the tassels of Jewish male garments, commonly worn during Jesus' time, with the tassels at the edge of those garments carrying a theological reminder of God's law, basically the religious bit of the outer garment. Could it be that she was being doubly superstitious and reaching out, not just for his cloak, but the religious bit on this travelling rabbi? I don't know. But all I know is that when folk reach out to Jesus in desperation, be it with superstition or bad doctrine or unhelpful religious baggage, he journeys with us. He doesn't push us away. In fact, he'll use those tassels to draw us closer in. And I can think of so many tassels, again, as a pastor, in my place over in Peckham at All Saints. We commonly get, and I'm sure it's the same in churches over in Hammersmith, all around the UK, we commonly get people rocking up to church services at Easter and at Christmas. Sometimes it's the only time they go to church because it's the festive thing to do. Or maybe there's people rocking up at baptisms, their great nephews being baptised, or sadly at a funeral. And in an odd and vague way, those services are treated sort of like the tassels. God, if you are there, then maybe at this place you'll meet me. Perhaps even tonight, we're listening, and it's a vague tassel for us. Is this real, God? And Jesus, the one who holds time in his hands, and he has time for you, he wants to pull you in, and he wants to journey with you. I get so many people saying to me, Greg, I wish I had your faith. And I say, friends, my faith is small as mustard seed. It's not about the amount of faith you have, that doesn't matter. It's the subject of the faith that matters. And our Jesus is mighty. So the second reason why Jesus is the best place to turn if you're desperate is that he won't turn you away. Third reason is because he will give you your life back. I just want to revisit Jesus' question again. He says, verse 45, who touched me? And as mentioned, Peter was quick in his response, but he was fairly slow on the uptake. Of course Jesus knew who touched him. That's not the point. He knew already because he knew so many things. Luke, if you know, His gospel has, the gospel writer, he's been at pains, as I've already mentioned, he's this historian, he's been at pains to convince us that this rabbi Jesus is more than just a rabbi, he's fully God. He's literally just calmed a raging storm. Many of us, we've been paddling in the sea and we've been knocked over by small waves. The sea is powerful. Jesus knows what he's doing by asking the question. He can calm raging storms. He knows who's touched him. Who touched me? The crowd pause. There's an awkward silence. Verse 46. Someone touched me. I perceive that power has gone out from me. Another awkward silence. And then those beautiful two verses, 47 and 48. When the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. You see, by asking the question, Jesus gives this woman the opportunity to stop hiding. He's not being mean. He's not trying to embarrass her, far from it. He wants to raise her up so that all can see that she actually has been healed. No longer is she ceremonially unclean. After 12 miserable years, she can have her life back. Once again, she can enjoy community. She can enjoy going for a cup of coffee like everybody else. Going to the park with people, telling jokes, hearing stories with people. Worship like everyone else in her community. Not on her own on YouTube, but in community. Not only that, she can know restoration and relationship with God. Jesus speaks so tenderly to her. She's probably older than he is in human years, and yet he says to her, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. We've seen the agony of Jairus' love for his daughter, so dear to him, so precious, and likewise this hopeless woman in Jesus' eyes, daughter. And again, I want to say to you, do you know you're precious to God? He made you, he loves you. Do you know that he wants you in his life, in his family, that he wants to call you his son or his daughter? No matter what the last 12 years of your life have been characterized by, you are so unbelievably loved. I mentioned watching church on YouTube just now, and just a really quick side note, and this has been so much the case since COVID. I've had so many people say to me, oh Greg, I just want to do church on my own at home now. I've been hurt by church in the past and I can watch it online. Everything's online these days. I don't need to go to church. I hear you. Lots have said similar things. But here in this passage we're learning that community is precious to Jesus. Family is precious to Jesus. We don't grow when we hide, and we miss out on good things when we hide. We're made to enjoy physical community, to appreciate things like touch. Anyway, that's a side point. Back to the little girl. Presumably the interruption of the bleeding woman took a bit of time. We know that, so much so that by the time Jesus and Jairus are able to carry on with their journey, news arrives. Verse 49, your daughter's dead. Don't trouble the teacher anymore. Well, we've read the whole passage, so we know how it ends. Despite the massive mourners and wailers showing up, this little girl is clearly dead. Despite all of that, Jesus inserts, she's not dead. She's just asleep. And then sure enough, he picks up her cold, lifeless, dead hand, this cold body, and he says, my child, arise. And we know, we've read the passage, she's up on her feet and she's got a bit of an appetite. And Jesus suggests, a good meal. That's a good idea right now, because he wants them to focus on the fact that she's living Life will go on as normal. The 12-year-old girl, she's had her life restored. The bleeding woman, she's got her life back after 12 years also. Jesus is in the business of life restoration. I should mention here before we come on to our last reason why Jesus is the best place to turn in desperation, that not everyone is healed physically in the here and now. It may well be you've prayed for healing, and that prayer, that particular prayer, hasn't been answered in the way that you had hoped it would be. Although we might pray for healing these days, physical healing isn't the focus of this passage we've been reading. Luke, the gospel writer, he often uses death and sickness as a way of showing our spiritual brokenness and sin. We've journeyed so far from God. God is light and life. And we thought, we're fine without him. We've kept the author of life at a distance. The author of life. And as such, spiritually we die. The bleeding woman, the dead girl, all a picture of that spiritual state before God. We're completely dependent on him for mercy. We can't do anything being dead. Completely dependent on him. And it's why during joy-filled baptism services, I love leading baptism services back in Peckham. It's just so joyful. But in those services, there's always quite a sobering moment where I ask those being baptized these words. I say, do you repent of the sins that separate us from God? Do you come to Christ, the way, the truth and the life? And some more questions. But I'm very conscious that so often people visiting, maybe as one of those tassels I said earlier, just visiting a service, God, if you're there, they're put off by that word repent. It seems so un-PC in their vocabulary. And yet, all the while, I'm also conscious that there's others, maybe some of us in here tonight, maybe some listening, who hear those words and they're feeling something very different inside. You feel this chiming with you somewhere in your inner being because, you long for newness. There's a hurt in there, deep down in your heart, and it's defined your last few years. You just want to break free. Maybe recently you've been struck by the malice in your own heart recently. You caught yourself muttering something plain mean, and it's pricked your conscience. You found yourself asking, if there is a God, what would he think of that? What would he make of that? I doubt he'd be very impressed. Maybe there's this gnawing feeling when you go to sleep at night that you're missing something in life, that there's more to all that you see and feel around you. But you can't work out what it is. Maybe you've got everything that the world prizes, but there's still this gnawing feeling. You don't know what it is and you want to find out. The great Narnian philosopher C.S. Lewis, he said these words. He said, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. I like that. And if that's you today, tonight, right now, if you come to Jesus in desperation, he wants to give you your life back, life in all of its fullness. That's my prayer for all of us, that we might know Jesus' restorative work in our lives. Fourth and final reason why Jesus is the best person to turn to if we're feeling desperate is because not only all of the other things, he's also willing to suffer for you. I want to remind you all of the reason Jesus is able to offer forgiveness and life even after we die. And it's because of that, being willing to suffer for us. I don't want to push this too far, but I believe this passage gives us a glimpse of this with his statement in verse 46, where he says, someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me. Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me. And we get this sense here that whenever Jesus changes a life, it costs him. in some way. We see it too as he approaches Jairus' home. The mourners are laughing at him. They're ridiculing him when he's saying he's come to wake this little girl up. His dignity, integrity, constantly undermined by some. There's a verse in the Bible, you may know it. It says, he was despised. This was written hundreds of years before Jesus was even born, but it's talking about him. It says, he was despised and rejected by men, acquainted with grief. Surely he has borne our griefs, carried our sorrows. The true cost of his love we see not here as power seeps out from him. We see on the cross as blood pours out from him, from his hands and his feet. And in that moment he experiences not just the physical pain of barbaric crucifixion, but worse by far, the spiritual torment of the distance and hurt we've all caused God. He bears it all. And we ask the question, why? Why would you do that, Jesus, if it were not for love? Do you realise tonight how much love Jesus must have for you? That he was willing to suffer for you. Real suffering. It wasn't just a show. It was real pain. Real tears. Real splinters. Real blood. So 4 reasons why Jesus is the best place to turn if you're feeling desperate, or even if you're not feeling desperate, you just want to experience life in all of its fullness. Because Jesus doesn't have a type, because Jesus won't turn you away, because Jesus will give you your life back, and because Jesus is willing to suffer for you. Jairus, he falls at Jesus' feet. The healed woman, she falls at Jesus' feet. How about us? Of course, we're not going to fall at his feet unless we believe that he lives. But what if he does? What then? I believe he does. He's the Lord of all history. And tonight he has his arms open wide and he's saying to each one of us, come home. Come back to me. I'm going to let you think about that for a few moments as we prepare to sing our final hymn, Yet Not I, but through Christ in me. Amen.